For this one, sir, here's what I got based on reviewing on the account. All right. I actually just confirmed this as well, not just me. In regards to the concerns, so basically, what happened here is that you're uploading Vimeo, right, to your website. So you have mentioned to me that you're not using your email, and I asked you earlier to check your email if there are notifications coming from GoDaddy that we are going to be censoring some of the content on your account or some of the videos on your website. So from what I can see here in my end, it's actually not GoDaddy who censor your contents to your website or your videos onto your website. It's actually Vimeo or YouTube.
Takeaway from the hearing yesterday. What do you think the public really deserves to know, and what really surprised you, if anything?
Well, that President Trump issued an executive order to the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, to, first of all, review what information we have on a host of issues, including the origin of COVID, the JFK assassination, a bunch of them, okay? But this was really, yesterday's hearing was really focused on the origin of COVID. And so Director Gabbard set up a unit, got experienced people, one individual, Jim Erdman, former CIA, well, he's still CIA, and formed this group to review these documents and then make them public. And the CIA sabotaged their efforts. They were surveilling their computers and their communications. And they certainly didn't provide the documents that the President of the United States ordered. So this is the deep state. In terms of the origins of COVID, I mean, I think we knew or highly suspected, what was revealed, what that group did find out, that Anthony Fauci has been funding gain-of-function research for years, if not decades, that he changed the definition of gain-of-function so he could evade the moratorium in 2015, that he predicted there'd be some kind of virus that the Trump administration have to deal with, that he was involved in an event with Rick Bright where they'd be mowing the fact they didn't have a universal vaccination program, flu didn't do it, would need some kind of pandemic, that the intelligence community was involved in the Event 201, which just laid out the playbook that was followed a couple months later when we actually had a pandemic, which, by the way, the infection fatality rate of COVID in the end was somewhere around like a bad flu season. And yet we freaked out the global population. We imposed on them, we mandated to many of them to take an experimental gene therapy, which now we know from the report I issued 2 weeks ago that FDA was made aware within 3 months that there were safety signals screaming at them with a different analytic program looking at VAERS, but I didn't need that because we went from an average of 280 deaths reported VAERS associated with vaccines from the inception of VAERS in 1990 to over 21,000 worldwide in 2021. That safety signal was screaming at me, but apparently not to the COVID cartel. But anyway, so we just see the deep state undermining the President of the United States, the Director of National Intelligence, and the legacy media is yawning. I mean, there's not one major news outlet, not CBS, NBC, ABC, PBS, CNN. I brought up last night with Jake Tapper. Hopefully he'll read the report and have me back on. But not one of those major news outlets has reported on my bombshell report from 2 weeks ago about the fact that Peter Marks, head of the division within FDA that approves vaccines and is supposed to surveil them for safety, was made aware of the fact their algorithm was going to hide the signals. And then 26 days later, he was shown a new algorithm that showed the signals. 25 of them, including sudden cardiac death, pulmonary infarction, Bell's palsy, different types of strokes. Month after month, you got new updates, more safety signals. They ignored them. They used the old algorithm that they knew was going to hide the signals, so they go and lie to the American people and say, well, we're just not seeing safety signals. I mean, it's It's a major scandal. I don't know how many tens, hundreds of thousands of people are permanently disabled or died because of their bold-faced lie to the American public, the violation of what their responsibility was to the American public, to make them aware, to fully inform them so the Americans had fully informed consent. For example, when they subjected their children to the injection because they were being told this is a pandemic of the unvaccinated, and if you didn't get vaccinated, you're going to kill your grandma. I mean, this is sick. This is evil, what was perpetrated on the American public by government. By government. The American people ought to be outraged, and at a minimum, the complicit media ought to at least be covering this, and they're not.
What accountability measures do you think there should be for officials that are allegedly involved in this, as well as for American media outlets that you said might have played a role in assisting that?
Well, if you were complicit in somebody's murder, what kind of accountability, what kind of criminal penalties would you have? Again, the American people were looking to the science, right? Fauci, he was the science. Looking to those people to tell them what we should do during COVID. They didn't fulfill their responsibility. They lied, okay? And as a result, people injected on their children. They took it themselves. People died. 24% of Americans, according to a Rasmussen poll, believe they knew somebody who died of the COVID injection. According to the American population. I don't know. I think those people who lied, that had the responsibility to tell us the truth, they ought to be subjected to some pretty serious criminal penalties. But if you don't have the mainstream media covering this, if they're just shrugging and go, well, that's just old news, we don't want to believe that. Currently, that's the state of affairs. I mean, this is a bombshell. All the actions Fauci took over the years, and he's just skating away with a pardon, with all the royalties he's made, with his big pension. You know, he used to have service protection. That's how Fauci's being held accountable. And, you know, I was on, Jake Tapper last night, and he's still kind of covering up. Well, Senator, I mean, there are biologists, computational biologists, that are still saying this is very plausible. This could have been, sprung from nature. What do you say about that? Well, again, those are the scientists that Fauci was providing grants to for years, totaling literally billions of dollars. That they're the ones that circle the wagons and initially reporting to Fauci, this sure looks man-made. Within a day or two of conversations with Fauci and Francis Collins and Jeremy Farrar, they're all going, oh, man-made, that's a conspiracy theory. Those people are kooks. They would think that. They were thinking it on January 30th. By February 2nd, they all circled the wagons, and they all supported Fauci to cover up his funding of gain-of-function research. That's what this is all about, to cover up for Fauci. Was that why they had this injection too, just hoping to end this pandemic? It was probably started because his gain-of-function, he just wanted to save the world from what he created or was responsible for creating.
Do you believe that the CCP has been held accountable enough?
Yeah, listen, I'm not going to exonerate the Chinese Communist Party in this, but I'm not going to exonerate the players here in the United States, Ralph Barrett, Anthony Fauci, Peter Daszak, and then Peter Marks and all the people that lied to the American public about the adverse events that they obviously were aware of. So, no, I'm not going to exempt those folks at all.
Thank you so much, Senator. Appreciate your
Thanks for having me on.
Everyone, I'm Anita Cicero, Deputy Director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, and today I will be your Master of Ceremonies for Event 201. On behalf of our center and our partners, the World Economic Forum and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation,
65 million people died in the first 18 months. The outbreak was small at first and initially seemed controllable, but then it started spreading in densely crowded and impoverished neighborhoods of megacities. From that point on, the spread of the disease was explosive. Within 6 months, cases were occurring in nearly every country. At first, wealthy countries with advanced healthcare and public health systems were primarily able to limit the spread of the disease within their borders. As systems became overwhelmed, however, no countries were able to control its spread. And the disease affected people of all socioeconomic status, from the very poor to the extremely rich, from sanitation workers to CEOs and national leaders. The economic consequences were dramatic. The high death toll and even greater numbers of sick hurt productivity in many industries. Manufacturers were having trouble filling orders, and countless companies in the service sector simply shut down. The global economy was in a free fall. The GDP down 11%. Stock markets around the world plummeted between 20 and 40% and headed into a downward cycle of fear and low expectation. Businesses were not borrowing, banks were not lending. Everyone was just hoping to hunker down and weather the storm. While nearly all businesses were affected, certain sectors were especially hard hit. Travel, finance, service, manufacturing, healthcare, and insurance among them, with some major companies going bankrupt. And there were seismic societal consequences as well. The world saw large-scale protests and in some places riots. People were angry about the lack of access to healthcare and medicine, as well as government's inability to protect them from the disease. This led to violent crackdowns in some countries and even martial law. Political upheaval became the rule across the globe. The public lost trust in their respective administrations. Several governments fell, while others were desperately striving to hold on to power. This spurred further crackdowns. Attempts to control media messaging, originally aimed only at health-related misinformation, became used increasingly to quash political dissent. Economists say the economic turmoil caused by such a pandemic will last for years, perhaps a decade. The societal impacts, the loss of faith in government, the distrust of news, and the breakdown of social cohesion could last even longer. We have to ask, did this need to be so bad? Are there things we could have done in the 5 to 10 years leading up to the pandemic that would have lessened the catastrophic consequences? We believe the answer is yes. So, are we as a global community now finally ready to do the hard work needed to prepare for the next pandemic?
Anyway, so let me just go on about NIH lifts funding pause on gain-of-function research. So let me explain this a little, because whenever this comes out, there's always the pushing back and forth from the press. So like NIH now is going to do dangerous research. No, actually, as a matter of fact, it's exactly the opposite. So a framework has been now established to guide funding decisions on proposed research that might be anticipated to create, transfer, or use enhanced potential pandemic pathogens. The program, everybody has to have a neat little name to it. This is called P3CO. So if you hear about P3CO, it's potential pandemic preparedness, care, and oversight. Now, why is this different from everything else we've been doing? It's different because remember the trouble we used to get in when someone would do an experiment, they would submit it to a journal, and just as it's getting ready to go out, everybody would start scrambling around, should we be publishing, should it not? So we decided to go upstream from that and talk about decisions that are made by government funded. Remember, we have no control over things that are not funded by the government, but in government funded activities to guide the funding decision before you actually do the experiment. I don't think this is going to be foolproof. Things are going to slip through, but I think this is a much better approach than we've had before. Okay, neglected tropical diseases, just to bring you up to date.
Then when you get a sequence of a virus and it looks like a relative of a known nasty pathogen, just like we did with SARS, we found other coronaviruses in bats, a whole host of them. Some of them looked very similar to SARS. So we sequenced the spike protein, the protein that attaches to cells. Then well, I didn't do this work, but my colleagues in China did the work. You create pseudoparticles, you insert the spike proteins from those viruses, see if they bind to human cells. And each step of this, you move closer and closer to this virus could really become pathogenic in people. So you narrow down the field, you reduce the cost, and you end up with a small number of viruses.
Viruses are. So if you want to find the next pandemic, you should do a lot of work in South America, where there are lots of bat species harboring lots of unknown viruses. You should also do a lot of work in Southeast Asia. So this becomes actually useful. So working with the USAID EPT PREDICT program and funding through NIAID to work on coronaviruses in China, we were able to test out this idea of predicting what the next emerging disease might be. So we've all heard of SARS. We know that SARS is carried by civets. Well, actually, the host of SARS-like viruses, the viruses that the SARS coronavirus emerged from, are bats. We discovered this a few years ago, published it. We found about 5 different viruses. You can see these ones in green. So we thought, okay, we've got an interesting set of viruses. It seems to be the origin of SARS. They're found in bats in China. It's a nice paper. We published it, I think, in Science. And, it was quite interesting. But then PREDICT came along, the USAID program, to discover new viruses in wildlife. And we worked in China to go out and do surveillance in other bat species and say, how many other SARS-like viruses are there? Is there something even closer to SARS? And sure enough, there was. And we've now found a very large diversity of SARS-like coronaviruses. Some are almost identical to SARS. In fact, there's one cave in Yunnan province that has every genetic element of the SARS coronavirus circulating in bats. And there are people out there who are hunting bats in that cave, eating them, people who live close by. And we're now doing surveillance of the people, and we've found using NIAID funding that actually there is potential of spillover into those people. We're starting to see some worrying signs in that part of the world. So here's a way to take the predictive side, go out and actually find evidence of a SARS-like virus spilling over into people, potentially.
Then we started looking, where did they come from? And we went out to southern China and did surveillance of bats across southern China. And we've now found, after 6 or 7 years of doing this, over 100 new SARS-related coronaviruses, very close to SARS. Some of them get into human cells in the lab. Some of them can cause SARS disease in humanized mouse models and are untreatable with therapeutic monoclonals, and you can't vaccinate against them with the vaccine. So these are a clear and present danger.
Yeah.
We've even found people with antibodies in Yunnan to SARS-related coronaviruses. So there's human exposure.
Right.
We're now doing surveillance. We're just beginning another 5 years of work to look at cohorts in southern China to say, well, how frequent does this spillover happen, and is it associated with disease? Because I expect, just like Nipah in Bangladesh, there are dozens and dozens of small spillovers going on the planet any one time, which we just never see.
Sure. Yeah, they never amplify. There are a few cases, and they're just absorbed in the illness, the overall illness of the population, right?
Now, you could say, so who cares? You know, and that's one argument. But our strategy is any one of those could become pandemic. There's a lot of stochasticity in what happens then.
Yeah.
So if we look at all of them, understand patterns, try and reduce the number of spillover events, we've got, you know.
But if you're saying these are diverse coronaviruses and you can't vaccinate against them, there are no antivirals, what do we do?
Well, so I think that coronaviruses are pretty good. I mean, you're a virologist, you know all this stuff, but you can manipulate them in the lab pretty easily. It's just spike protein drives a lot of what happens with the coronavirus, zoonotic risk. So you can get the sequence, you can build the protein, and we work with Ralph Barrick at UNC to do this. Insert it into a backbone of another virus, and do some work in the lab. So you can get more predictive when you find a sequence. You've got this diversity. Now, the logical progression for vaccines is if you're going to develop a vaccine for SARS, people are going to use pandemic SARS as
sure.
But let's try and insert some of these other related and get a better vaccine.
And I guess also knowledge of what's there. If you see something emerging, it give it a head start on making a vaccine or a therapeutic.
That's true, and you know, better knowledge of where they are as well, so that you can put your money into these clinics that matter.
What happens when these sort of things occur is if they don't kill a lot of people, we just move on, especially when it comes to influenza, which people seem to think is just a word that means I don't feel well. Why would we want a universal vaccine? How does this work? How is a pandemic different than what we get every year? And where are we?
Whereas influenza is very unique in that it is a virus, a group of viruses. There are different kinds of influenza A, and let's just focus on influenza A, that tend to, we use the terminology drift from season to season, in that there are mutations that change it enough so that you really need to get vaccinated each year, and you try to anticipate the right match between a vaccine and the virus that will be circulating. And then every once in a while, as Michael alluded to, you have a very dramatic change, either by mutations or by evolutions from animal influenzas that jump species, recombine or what have you, and you have something that's called a shift or a real big change. That's really unique. I mean, viral infections that we deal with, polio, smallpox, measles, et cetera, don't do that. So we're dealing with a continual moving target from season to season and the threat of a pandemic. So the title of this session is The Quest for a Universal Flu Vaccine. So when we talk about a universal flu vaccine, it really right now is an aspirational goal, in that the quest being to make a vaccine that induces a response in the body to that part of the influenza that doesn't change from season to season, from decade to decade, or even that much when you get a pandemic, with the ultimate aspirational goal of having a vaccine that you could give relatively infrequently compared to now, which you needed every year. That could be every 5 years, every 10 years, or what have you, that covers the broad array of the influenzas that we would be experiencing. So that's in a nutshell.
Why don't we blow the system up? I mean, obviously we can't just turn off the spigot on the system we have and then say, hey, everyone in the world should get this new vaccine we haven't given to anyone yet. But there must be some way that we grow vaccines mostly in eggs, the way we did in 1947.
I think it's also that we haven't had this sense of urgency.
Do we need to have lots of people die for that sense of urgency to occur?
Well, the incredible thing is that lots of people do die every year, and yet we aren't mobilizing. You know, I would have to say, to be more positive, since I can't really answer the question of why has it taken us so long, because I think it shouldn't have, and you know, there really is not a good excuse. The science has had to move forward. Gaps in the science still persist, including our understandings about, you know, immune protection, in addition to understanding the nature of this particular virus, which has its complexities. Certainly, part of the problem has been that it's much safer for a company to just keep doing what it's doing than to try to do something new. But it's also, I think, we haven't funded all the work that needs to be done. And on an optimistic note, there's a lot going on now. And Tony is leading efforts, and there are other efforts, Gates Foundation, the European Union Research Horizon 2020, many other activities as well.
People always say to me, why should I get a flu vaccine? And I always say 23% is better than 0%. And as far as my math goes, that is true. And I'm just sort of curious, why are we so bad at protecting ourselves from what many people consider the sort of most likely virus to cause the most damage to humanity?
And if we take that scenario that Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation funded from the Institute for Disease Modeling that says if we had another outbreak like a pandemic virus today, what we saw in 1918, in that 6-month time period, we would have 33 million people dead. And not only that, that virus would have been seeded all around the globe. So we're still behind the gun on the tools we use to make the vaccines. We have some reasonable vaccine foundations, and we can make them better by adding adjuvants or with our high-dose vaccines that are not fully utilized. And a lot of parts around the world don't have access to the vaccines at all. And so I think that the sense of urgency needs to be there, Michael, but also the fact that we need to leverage the tools we have and at the same time envision what that universal flu vaccine is in a very rapid, urgent pace to get there. Right now, they're, as you said, mediocre and slow. A mediocre and fast vaccine is even better than a mediocre and slow vaccine, honestly. But we can make better vaccines and make them faster. But $361 billion every year is our economic cost for seasonal influenza. In a pandemic, that goes into the trillions of dollars. You know, we have to take that sense of urgency, that economic cost, that societal disruption, and the lives lost into perspective to think, how do we gather this information and share it in a very targeted way to accelerate development of one of these better, faster vaccines?
There was a discussion there about this sort of cascade from communication to coordination to collaboration to convergence. And we need to sort of work our way down that pipeline to make sure that we're actually getting all the way to the end to try to bring in as much as possible to take on this problem.
And I was starting to develop some public health preparedness programs. And I went to FEMA to talk to them about doing a tabletop exercise with us around preparedness for a biological threat. And we were going to do a flu pandemic-like scenario. And they said, you know, we don't do infectious disease. We do hurricanes, we do floods, you know, earthquakes, all kinds of disasters, but, you know, disease outbreaks? And I persuaded them to participate. And it was a remarkable thing to watch them as events unfolded, realizing just how much this kind of an outbreak would undermine all of the essentials of civic life, how it would undermine their own ability to mobilize and respond to needs, and also the recognition of the economic costs and productivity costs, in addition to the medical concerns, and ultimately the loss of faith of people in government and leadership because of the failure to be able to provide vaccine in a timely way and other things.
Is that in order to make the transition from getting out of the tried and true egg growing, which we know gives us results that can be, you know, beneficial. I mean, we've done well with that, to something that has to be much better. You have to prove that this works, and then you've got to go through all of the clinical trials, phase 1s, phase 2s, phase 3, and then show that this particular product is going to be good over a period of years. That alone, if it works perfectly, is going to take a decade.
People just still don't think enough about what this really means in our daily lives and what the impacts are, even though every year we're suffering a lot of preventable death, illness, and disability.
Well, that's why I asked the dark and unpleasant question, does something really bad have to happen? I mean, it seems to me one of the curses of the public health world is if you guys do your job well, everyone goes along and they're healthy.
And they cut your funding.
Right.
At Flu Lab, our ambition is to defeat influenza. 650,000 people died last year, and they will die this year, and they will die next year. And we seek a transformative product. I think that we can absolutely, in parallel with the pursuit of an iterative process, I think in parallel we can yes and this. We need to set an ambition for the ultimate vaccine. This is broadly protective. It is once a year, or once in a lifetime. It is durable. It is for everyone on this planet, and it eliminates this annual scourge, and it eliminates the pandemic threat. We've all been talking about the need for urgency. Are we organized in the right way to make permanent progress and meet this goal? This problem, the scale of it, requires unprecedented collaboration. It requires a new model for global collaboration and dedicated leadership and an ecosystem that's willing to engage and support it.
It seems to me what we're talking about, we've all been talking about, is a kind of two-track system where we do what we've been doing because we have no choice. We're not going to ditch that system right now, but we develop something more powerful and permanent, and that requires a different kind of entity. And I'm wondering who is going to run that entity, because I don't really think the government is probably the answer.
You know, we've really been asking ourselves and our community sort of the really hard question is, are we organized in the right way to harness the new scientific insights and this passion?
I think if there was a single focus entity in influenza, then that target and that timeline would be accelerated to bring the best science, bring together those interdisciplinary thoughts. I mean, we're in this room, we're probably vaccinologists, we're probably immunologists, we're probably working on some vaccine, made some vaccine at some point in our life, but we're not the chemical engineers or the other engineers or the anthropologists or others who bring critical insight and how you disrupt and deconstruct an age-old problem. And we've had these vaccines for 70 years. So this is an age-old construct that requires those creative chefs to come out of the kitchen and deconstruct the carrot cake and make it look like something different, but the best carrot cake you've ever eaten in your entire life. We need that for an influenza vaccine.
In case we haven't figured this out already, this is really very complicated, not only from a scientific and public health standpoint, but from a perception standpoint. So it is a perception which is a misperception that it is not a serious disease. But as Casey said, hundreds of thousands of people die of it each year. And when you get a pandemic, millions and millions of people. So we really do have a problem of how the world perceives influenza. And it's going to be very difficult to change that unless you do it from within and say, I don't care what your perception is, we're going to address the problem in a disruptive way and in an iterative way, because you do need both.
We need this moment of energy, this burst that complements everything that we've been doing for these years and collecting lots of information. This advocacy group that is single focused, that goes to Congress, goes around the world, says people are dying. The urgency, the time is now, and this group is focused on it. It is the advocacy group, that is the lobby group, it is whatever the group does, but it's got to get money from philanthropy, it's got to get money from government, it's got to not be distracted by these cycles and bureaucracy to get the job done.
One of the other complicating issues with flu is that as the human species evolved, you developed an adaptive immune system, which means that if you get exposed to something and then later on you get exposed to the same or similar thing, your body will remember it and make a good immune response. That really helps you, it saves civilization, it's very good in the immune system. With influenza, there's a thing called imprinting. People refer to it somewhat inappropriately as original antigenic sin. And if you get exposed to an H1N1 when you're an infant, every time you see any influenza, be it H3N2 or H2N2, your body is going to make a response against that, but it's going to be very distracted and it's going to go back and make H1N1. When you do get a universal flu vaccine, you're going to want to give it to 6-month-old kids.
You're going to want to give it to 6-month-old kids.
Because a universal flu vaccine, even for me at my age, is not going to be universal. It's going to call up other things that I've been exposed to.
We need, number one, this time to be different, and we also need to really organize ourselves in a way where there will be accountability for sustained action and not just response.
In the long run, over time, amortized, if the 2009 pandemic had been much more deadly, would that have ended up being a better thing for humanity?
Senator, indeed, we recently made, before Christmas last year, a $400 million payment to the NIH for an old patent that they had developed, not related to COVID, but useful in the development of a COVID vaccine to pay them for their work. It's for the U.S. government to assess how that money should be used.
Do you think it creates a conflict of interest for the same people deciding the policy of how often we have to take the vaccine to also be making money the more times we take the vaccine? Yes or no?
This is for the government to decide.